how do you navigate profound loss and the grief that follows? Our guest today is Dan Tocchini. He's been helping leaders transform their teams for over 35 years. He's worked with executive teams from Interstate Batteries to ESPN to Smarty Pants Vitamins and Impulse Space, as well as nonprofits like Homeboy Industries and Defy Ventures. And he's a returning guest. We talk a lot about how to transform cultures back in episode 475. And that was awesome. And actually invited Dan back because we wanted to talk about grief and mourning, because at the end of that conversation, we brought up grief and mourning and it was like, oh, that's a whole conversation in itself. So here we are. We're going to have that conversation. I'm really excited about it. And it's something, because grief is something that we all experience, and yet so few of us understand how to navigate through that. And so we're going to talk about that here today. Dan, welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Nicole. Always a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, likewise, always a pleasure to have you. And I do want to do a shout out again to the team at Podcast Virtuoso, because they're the ones who recommended Dan. So thank you to the team there. And also Adrian Kaler, who's actually on our show as well in a 2-part. These guys are awesome. I'm telling you, you got to check out their information, because I don't do 2 parts too often. So for both of them, doing 2-parters means that some good transformational conversations that are happening there. So yeah, well, let's dive in. Let's talk about, Dan, your own personal experience with loss and grief. I think that's an important place to start. So you're not talking about theory, you're talking about personal experience as we go through this conversation. Yeah.
Well, let's start. We all face grief and loss, loss, grief, and mourning in our lives at some point, obviously. And it started for me when I was a young boy. My mother was a schizophrenic manic depressive, and at about 12 years old, she was hospitalized for the first time. And she didn't have any of the symptoms. It didn't come up till after she had my younger brother. He's 9 years younger than me, and just after she gave birth to him, she had the first manifestation and was hospitalized in a catatonic state. And that was my first, when I think back to my childhood, that was probably the first time I experienced the sense of loss, basically up until that point, as I remember it, and memory has its faults, but it was a happy, wonderful, experience in my family with my dad and my mom. And I have 2 brothers and a sister. My sister's 4 years younger. I have a brother 2 years younger, a sister 4 years younger. And then the youngest brother is 9 years younger. And then the preceding years were pretty rough, dealing with her and everything that went on, and getting in touch with what it takes to stay connected to her in this state. It scattered the family pretty heavily, and my dad ended up later on, they divorced. When I was 18, they divorced, but it was a mess from the time I was 12 to I was about 18, 19 when they finally got divorced. And that in itself was another, huge loss. And at the same time as they got divorced, my grandfather, who I was very close to, had died just 6 months before they announced their divorce. And my favorite aunt died a year before that. So a lot of loss at a relatively young age. And it's set, I think about what happened for me out of that. I went into deep drug addiction. I was dealing with cocaine and got myself all tangled up in that. And anything to numb the feelings or the sense of sorrow that I was terrified of, and loss and anger and rage and all the different emotions that come up. So it started early, and then a number of losses. I lost my brother-in-law, died of an overdose. My wife's brothers, one of her favorite brothers, and they were very close. That was tragic. And then her grandmother, her father, and her mother died, and her brother all died within like a 4-year period.
Wow.
And that was a huge deal. And then, out of that, in years, we grew and worked at the family together, and we had 2 kids and 5 grandkids. And just about a year and a half ago, a year and a quarter ago, my youngest grandchild, Eon, was 2.5 years old, and he was crushed, killed in his house. A redwood tree dropped on it and killed him, and almost killed my son, blew him out of the house. And so that was a
Wow.
tragic loss. And so as a family, we've become accustomed to suffering, in the sense that it's one of those things that, this might sound weird, but I don't know if you ever, Muhammad Ali had a saying that really captures it for me. He said, "It's not the mountain before you that will stop you. It's the pebble in your shoe."
Yeah.
And that really hit home. The other thing that really hit home for me is in the scripture, Jesus says, if you want to gain your life, you have to lose it. There are a number of paradoxes when it comes to suffering. I've found that there's no answer. Everybody suffers differently. Everybody has a different process of grieving and mourning. But I've discovered very powerful, what I would say, relational or spiritual principles. And that if I give myself to them, in my experience, I've met God there. I can't define that, but I don't want to even try to conceptualize it, because the purpose of grieving is very distinct from the purpose of thinking. You can't figure it out. There's no answers. It's not really about finding answers or figuring it out or conceptualizing it, even though we may talk about some principles here and some concepts that doesn't bring any relief. Really, grieving for me is about learning new ways of being in the world. Because when somebody dies, particularly somebody close to you, or you have a loss, and it doesn't have to be a person dying, a business could be dying, anything that you've grown accustomed to, that you love participating in, it's probably contributed to your sense of identity and community. When you lose something, the first thing your brain starts to do is wonder who you are now.
Yeah.
And where do I stand now? Who am I without this? And it's a big process. It's a process of, in my experience, curiosity and exploration, and the very things that we don't want to do, we probably ought to do. Like when my grandson was killed, the first thing I knew to do was to get the whole family together, because the tendency is to want to go off in a silo and kind of deal with it the best you can. And we've found that through the years, the best thing to do is to come together and share the grief, however it shows up for you, and make room for other people's grieving process, and to understand the difference between grieving and mourning, right? That's a big deal. Grieving is the loss of something you love and it brought meaning to your life and like that. And mourning is the loss of the possibilities or opportunities that will never come about because of the loss.
Yeah.
And that's, both of those are important to both to look into, and to allow yourself the privilege of and the honor of experiencing it. But most people are terrified of, a lot of, we're just naturally terrified of it, because the feeling is we're never going to come out of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So when my dad died, I felt that feeling of, and I called it like there's faith, hope, and love. And I was asking myself, why? I mean, I got that I was obviously grieving. It happened suddenly. Both my parents died suddenly. And so there really wasn't time to prepare for that. And so he went first, and my mom less than 2 years later.
Yeah.
But
which is often the case, by the way.
Yes. Yes. Well, they had been together for 49 years. We were planning the 50th anniversary for the following year. And she literally died of a broken heart. She had a massive heart attack. And my dad actually died of a silent heart attack. And I think the fact that they both died of a broken heart, literally, was a testament to some grief that hadn't been processed in their
Yeah.
life. And
Yeah, there's all kinds of research on
yeah,
how dangerous you know unresolved grief and sorrow are to
yeah.
the body.
And when my dad died, I remember thinking, I have faith. I had some other losses and things that had happened prior, and I'd kind of gone through that question and had gotten to the place of being settled there. And I was kind of rebuilding my life. And I was at a place where I had faith and I knew I had love, my mother and my brother and all, and that was great. But what I was like, what is it? And I was missing that hope, because when my dad died, all of, just like you described, all of the dreams that we had, the unfulfilled dreams, the things that we were still planning, the things that we had worked so hard for and felt elusive that we were still working towards, all of that was gone. Because even if we would have accomplished those things, it wouldn't have been the same, because he was larger than life. I mean, you met him, actually. I don't know if you remember that, but probably met tons of people, but he was larger than life. And so for him not to be there and to do those things, it wouldn't be the same.
Yeah,
And
it's a huge void. I mean, obviously, I can feel it without even knowing him.
yeah. And so, there's something we can talk about. I'd love to talk about the compounding grief as well, like what you're talking about, compounding loss, because it's like that. When you said the pebble in your shoe, and I think like some of us, it's like we have a lot of pebbles in our shoes, not just one. Like there's more and more that build up. Because so my mother passed less than 2 years later, ended up getting divorced. That's a whole story in itself. But so I lost my mother, my father, and my husband, and I moved out all within a very short period of time. And it was after a lot of, I lost a business, and then previously business, all the things. So it was like it was all coming to a head. And I went up to Northern California just to kind of like, God said, just come away with me. And so I was going through this book on grief. It was a grief recovery handbook, and it had me go through this list, right? To list all the losses, all of the grief, the moments of grief and all that. And I started listing this out. And I'm a coach. I've worked on a lot of the bigger things. But what I realized is when I went through that process, that there were a lot of little pebbles. There was a lot of little things along the way that I was like, oh man, I've dealt with that. Until all of a sudden, looking back on it, realizing I hadn't dealt with those things because they were compounding. It was like a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. And all of a sudden I'm feeling like, so talk a little bit about, from a transformational standpoint, from your perspective, what do we do with that? Because I think a lot of people are at that point right now, and especially COVID. I think if they didn't have it before, they had it because of COVID, this loss of COVID was a great example, right? By that time I had already gone through all this. And so I was kind of like, oh man, whatever, bring it. Like I'm ready, because I've already been through enough, in the sense that I feel like it didn't have as much effect on me as it did on many people. You talk about the identity. Certainly my identity. I remember, let me just back up. I remember driving down the highway in Toronto after my mom had died. And my uncle, he actually died 9 months later, but my uncle said to me, how does it feel to be an orphan? And I was like, well, thank you. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but thanks for pointing that out. That was like a week after my mom had died. And I remember thinking about that and driving down the road and realizing that this journey, when God says, trust in me, not man, it's not because we're not supposed to be trusting them. It's that he's the only one. I realized he's the only one who's never going to leave me. He's never, voluntarily or involuntarily, he is never going to leave me. So it's like, okay, we're on this journey together. So my identity was repositioned based on my relationship with him. Now COVID hits, and I saw all of it because of that perspective that I had. I saw everyone kind of looking, not everyone, most people having an identity that was now being taken away from them based on their job, couldn't do certain things. And so there was a lot of grief, and there was a lot of trying to, like the toilet paper thing, right? I mean,
Oh yeah.
what's the deal? It had nothing to do with toilet paper. That had nothing to do with toilet paper, but it was just like fascinating to see it, and also sad to see it, because there was this fear, this hurt, this wound that had been opened up. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that, so one of the things I work to do, first off, is when I think about grieving, I just had a friend write me and ask me to write a book on this, so I'm working on it now. And then you asked to do this conversation, which is great. But they asked me to write a book because they watched how we kind of came through Eon, and they've watched us through the years. And the gal who asked me she works with couples, and she's there because there's a lot of grieving going on and just a lot of sorrow with the couple she's working with, a number of couples. She's quite a relationship coach, well known. And I talked to her a lot about grieving, and she's just because she's working with her clients and she's wants to really support them. And one of the things that it requires is the willingness to look into the very things you want to get away from. Right. It's a paradox. You want to lose, you want to gain your life, you have to lose it. And to lose your life means to look right into the abyss, right into the things that you've lost that you don't want to be reminded of the loss of. And to do that takes a deep level of courage and, if you will, faith or trust in God that you're going to be met in the process. So when Eon died, one of the things my son called me to let me know, and my wife and my daughter happened to be in the room when he called, and he said, we lost him. He was hysterical because he had just got done. Couldn't get the log off the boy's body, off of Eon's body, and so they tried a truck. It didn't work. It was just a huge tree, right? So they had to cut both ends of it off and then roll it off him, and then my son carried his boy to the paramedic, when they couldn't save him. There was no blood, thank God. The little guy was just out instantly. And, when they heard, my wife, immediately they fell. We all went to different places. I get very calm. So, immediately we set up a place and left the next morning to get down to where he's at. And we just stayed together, all of us, all our families, for 2 months in an Airbnb. And the objective of it was to be accept nothing but to look into and to be able to communicate together whatever came up for us. And there was no right way to do it. It was just lots of room for us. And it was interesting because the level of honesty and just the raw level of honesty opened up, transformed all of our relationships. And we had, in the process, started to realize that this was Eon working with us here. This was like his love brought us together, and was going, and was, we started to feel, it's this paradox. Like you have this great loss, and all of a sudden you feel this deep intimacy that you never even imagined would be there if you turned into the very thing you're, afraid of, and shared the journey with each other. Yeah. And in it, there's I don't know if you've ever read Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky.
No.
But as a young, when I was recovering from my cocaine addiction, I got in touch with how much unresolved grief and sorrow and loss that I had. Because the year my grandfather died and my parents broke up, my girlfriend for 4 years, we split up. I lost my scholarship at school. I broke my foot. I got involved in drugs. I left school. It was just a complete unraveling. And the recovery time of me coming back into myself took a number of years. But I read that book, The Brothers Karamazov, which really helped me come face to face with and see the value in the mourning and the grief that was waiting for me, like a gift.
Hmm.
But as long as I walked without facing it, it's like a pebble in my shoe was crippling me. I was reactive with my wife. I was hard to talk to. I had a chip on my shoulder. I was angry. There's a million things that were coming out of me that I didn't understand and never directly saw until I started grieving. And when I read this book, it started bringing some attention to it. And there's a quote in the book by Father Zosima, who is the kind of the God figure, and he's teaching. He's a saint who of the church, and he's known for his wisdom, and people come to him. And he's got a novitiate, and the novitiate is a young Karamazov. There's 3 brothers and 4 brothers, and they're the Karamazov. This is the youngest one, and he's kind of the Christ figure. Anyway, he's serving Zosima as he's walking around speaking to people who are in suffering that have come to see him. And this one lady brings to him her daughter who's been dying, who's been crippled and suffering for life. And she's asking him, please, can you heal her? And he says that this is what he says to her. He says, if you do not attain happiness, always remember that you're on a good path and try not to leave it. Above all, avoid lies, all lies, especially the lie to yourself. Keep watch on your own lie and examine it every hour, every minute. And avoid contempt both of others and of yourself. Now, that's an interesting line because I've noticed that's what comes up when somebody invites me to mourn. I find contempt comes up for me. And, why is that? Well, because it's like there's a shame factor that this is a weakness. Like somehow mourning loss is a weakness and it causes contempt. Contempt is the flip side of shame. It's what I feel shame. And then if somebody exposes my weakness, I get contemptuous to drive them from the weakness. So I'm no longer exposed to make it about them. Right. So when he says that for others or yourself, like I'm a lot of my addiction was a contempt for myself. How could I let this happen? How could I make these mistakes? And I couldn't go back and correct them. So the drug was a way to kind of numb the futility of that, So he says, what seems bad to you in yourself is purified by the very fact that you've noticed it in yourself. And avoid fear, though fear is simply the consequence of every lie. He says, never be frightened at your own faint-heartedness in attaining love. And meanwhile, don't even be frightened by your own bad acts. I'm sorry that I cannot say anything more comforting because active love is a harsh and fearful thing compared to love and dreams. Love and dreams thirst for immediate action, quickly performed and with everyone watching. Indeed, it will go as far as even giving its life, provided it doesn't take long, but is soon over and on stage and everyone's looking on, praising. Whereas active love is labor and perseverance, and for some people, perhaps a whole science. But I predict that even in that moment, that very moment, when you see with horror that despite all of your efforts, you not only have you not come nearer your goal, but seem to have gotten farther from it. At that very moment, I predict this to you. You will suddenly reach your goal, and you will clearly behold over you the wonder-working power of the Lord, who all the while has been loving you, and all the while has been mysteriously guiding you.
Wow.
That sense of being guided came to me as I allowed myself to suffer the loss of my mother and father and the family the way it was. And all of a sudden, and when I started reading this and it started making sense to me, I had a wife and a little baby who's now 40 years old. And I started realizing that all of that suffering, the little I had been willing to suffer, and now the more I was willing to look into it, was bringing home to me the very thing I'd lost. And I remember it came because when I was coming, I used to not like to go home, right? When my son was just a young baby and I had just come out of my addiction, I never liked going home. I couldn't understand why I resisted going home. And I realized that as I started looking into that suffering, instead of running from it and getting high, I kept asking myself, why is it I don't want to go home? What's this emotion going on? And it brought back all kinds of memories of how I hated going home after school and seeing my mother in the condition she was in and dealing with all the conflict. The home was not a place I wanted to go to. And when I started seeing this, I started wanting to go home. And I started looking forward to seeing Danny and my wife and sitting down and having dinner and helping prepare and doing those things. All of a sudden, they had meaning they didn't previously had until I was willing to look into my suffering and ask, what is this? What's going on? And that opened up a ton. And that all came out of reading this book. But that particular passage was really stuck with me. And I keep it close by at all times because it reminds me that there's something bigger than me. And I don't have an eternal view. I have a temporal view, and there's something eternal going on all the time, and that we're being invited into something bigger than our mere survival. And Jordan Peterson, I think he said it. He said, "There's something worse than death, and that's living a life that's untrue. That's not real. It's like men die at 27. We just bury them at 72.
Yeah.
It's
Well, I think there's that disassociation that happens, and I can felt that for myself. I mean, there was a point where I went through, certainly when you talk about the contempt, I can relate to that feeling of contempt for myself and also for others. And then when I would see people grieve or I'd see people emotional, I kind of was like, my initial reaction wasn't compassion. My initial reaction was contempt. Because somehow I was disconnected in myself. And it's like, if I can't feel, then you can't feel.
Yeah, like a disdain for weakness. That's how it showed up for me. My wife would start to mourn over something and I'd get angry at her. And she said, "What are you mad at?" It was contempt. It was disdain for what I judged as weakness. I had judged weakness in me, like that was somehow weak. And she really helped me get in touch with that by exploring that. Like, why are you mad when I grieve over something like this? Are you okay? Like, she was so open about it. It didn't she didn't get contemptuous back. She got curious about it. Really helped me along. And that's when we said as a family, that's what we did for each other, is kind of help each other along and really listen and invite whatever was there, whether it was anger, rage, sorrow, sadness, despair. We just like welcomed it into the relationship as it came up.
Yeah. Well, it's so counterintuitive, right? I don't want to feel this, so how do I avoid that? I move away from it. And then you wonder why you're numb and why you can't, enjoy and really have a fullness of life, right? Because
it's counterintuitive because we're programmed biologically. The brain's programmed to keep yourself alive and to keep the body alive, and that it also is designed to save energy in case it needs it to keep the body alive. So if we start mourning about something, you're like it feels like the vulnerability, like you could be attacked and you're not going to see it coming. So naturally, the body's going to have that reaction. And I think a lot of people judge themselves for it, but it's just, in my experience, it's just the human being. I was a chaplain for 8 years. We did a ton of study and work on grieving and how to be present with somebody who is grieving. And, Mary Kubler-Ross and the stages of grief, which don't happen linearly. They happen when they want to happen. And they happen differently for everybody.
Yeah. Well, and let's talk about the physical side of it. We were talking about that before we hit record. This idea of, like, sometimes we think of ourselves or like to compartmentalize, but we can't.
Yes.
And we're a whole being. And so there's physical things that are happening in our body. And I've known a lot of clients, and I've known this for myself, is that it's like there's something going on in my body and I don't understand why. And it's not just the natural aging. It's like stuff's happening and nobody can explain it or resolve it. And when I dug down deeper, it was like, okay, I went through the layers of the mental, the emotional, their spiritual, obviously like the physical first, right? Like, okay, what do I need to do? That's what we're used to, right? I go to the doctor, or in my case, alternative solutions and so forth. But yeah, talk about that, because go ahead.
Yeah, I noticed, people tighten up around suffering. If you can't, you don't want it. So what you do is you stuff it and then you try to control it. And that dis-ease, that's what it is. I'm not at ease with it.
Yeah.
It goes into the body. And like I said, there's a ton of research on this. I read one article that by a neuroscientist who had studied grief and the lack of grieving and mourning. And he said that the brain actually has to be taught to grieve. And that, the Hebrew religion, they have mourners, professional mourners. They come to funerals to mourn. So it'll like a siphon helps other people get into their mourning. And if they don't, this article said that it's like smoking a half a pack of cigarettes a day to the body. It creates all kinds of hormonal reactions and so on that are equal to that kind of pollution in your body. And you can see it in people, the stiffness, and usually people shut down and need to be alone because they don't want to be overcome by it. And that's a physical reaction. It becomes automatic. But socially, it breaks down, relational connections. But how we connect with others, we certainly don't want to get too close to them if we're trying to avoid that feeling again. Like if I've lost someone I care about, I don't want to get connected to more people. If I don't want that, if my aim becomes I never want to experience that again. Now I'm faced with isolation and loneliness because I won't allow myself to be known or invest too much in others outside of the functional transactional life I have. And so it produces a deep loneliness and isolation, and people misunderstand and judge, and there's all kinds of shenanigans and mischief that spring up around the withholding of myself that way.
Yeah.
And I've seen it do a lot of work in the training room with people over the last 40 years. I think I have close to 50,000 hours in a room with people, and I can actually tell from language and body posture what might be bothering them, or what, I had one guy who had lost his son at an early age, and the way he was talking just gave me the impression that he had lost a child. And I asked him, and he almost fell over. How'd you know? I said, the way you're standing, the things you're saying, you seem so guarded and prepared to make sure nobody gets too close, that it just occurred to me that you must have lost a child or someone that close to you. And he just fell apart, and it was really powerful. And he was terrified of doing that because he was afraid of it being used against him. It might freak his wife out. She may not want to be with him. All kinds of things unraveled out of it. But the energy that he had after mourning was phenomenal. He was freed up, light. He's written me a number of different notes from time to time. I get a note from him thanking him for the conversation, because he was pretty edgy. And I just said, wow, here's what I think. I'm going to just tell you what I think. And it penetrated him. But I think that's a big deal, is just to help, like, to stand with somebody in a way that you can contain their reactions and still, it's like a form of trust. I'm going to trust that their upset isn't really about me. They're going through something. So even though that they're striking out, they can still be trusted. They can, so I keep to bestow enough trust to keep inquiring, even when I get, slammed, to keep the invitation open. And then if they don't want to talk, okay, I understand, but to let them know the invitation's still there. That's a big deal. So.
Well, I think about transformational coaches, executive coaches, trainers, people that are in the room. I mean, we're engaging with people all the time. And if we aren't trained equipped to be able to handle that. There's a lot of stuff that happens. You hear people say things like, oh, this person, or they write them off. And
Yeah,
there's
well, yeah,
really something deeper underneath the surface that's happening.
yeah,
So where do we start with equipping ourselves from a practical standpoint? Okay, like,
yeah.
this is
It's
a,
funny because the book I'm writing starts with that. It starts with that idea that mourning, for me, like this gal asked, how did you guys come together like a family like this? And my point, when I thought about the answer, I said, well, I can't say that I said, no, I think the biggest thing that as a family is we've always worked at the discipline of being responsible, like owning my part in what's going on and being curious about what else I can provide, what else is wanted and needed, not externalizing my experience to the circumstances, even though we can be victimized. We can be, things can happen to us we had no choice about. But how I receive them, what I make up about them, how I move forward from there, that's the discipline. And then if I keep practicing standing responsibly, and by the way, in order to stand responsibly, you got to have courage. You got to be willing to consider things that you don't want to consider, just to see how much of what you're considering could be true, when it might be true, how it might be true, like aspects of myself that I don't like seeing, embracing them welcoming them in to take their place in my body. That takes courage. It takes a relentlessness. It takes the willingness to, what I say, keep kicking at your own indifference until it bleeds life. I there are just things that, and the way I do that is I imagine if I don't do it, what future's coming. Like people would say, well, I don't understand. That just seems too, like, what's the point? Well, the point is, if you don't do it, what do you end up with? That's what I ask myself. Like when my mother-in-law was dying of cancer in our house, we were taking care of her the last couple of years of her life, including administering the morphine, etc., as she died. I wanted to run. It was, and I remember sitting on the couch thinking, who I am now, who I become in this moment, is either going to strengthen my bond with my wife, or it's going to weaken it. It's
mhm.
either going to strengthen our family or it's going to weaken it. If I run now, who will I become? Who will we become? How will we think of each other? Because I don't get this, not a takeover. I don't get to go, oh, we want to do it. I want to do over with your mother's death. That doesn't happen. And so when I'm laying in bed thinking about this, because I'm thinking about ways to get out of the house, ways to stay away from what is uncontrollably it's out of my control. You know, all this that's going on with my children. My son was, I think, 12 or 13, and his sister was 9 or so. How do we deal, or 8? How do we deal with this? I remember making my mind up that I was going to stay in it and I was going to be present for my wife and I was going to do whatever it takes to do that, because I saw that she would then know how much I cared for her and her mother, and it was bigger than just what I was experiencing. And I found that attitude transformed my experience, where I started to really feel and get reward from connecting with people in the family as they walk through their own loss and fear and suffering. It made a huge difference. And I'll never forget, my mother-in-law had died. It was a couple of days after her death, and we were in our house. My daughter was 8 or 9 years old, and she was walking around the house. I was watching her, and I wouldn't, if I had run from this, I wouldn't want to see what I saw. But she was, she'd put on music, turn it off, go over here. She couldn't make her antsy, couldn't make her mind up what she wanted to do. And I realized this was her mourning. Mourning is trying to come out of her. I could see it, right? Like she was,
Yeah.
and so I said, come here, honey. And I put her on my lap and I just pulled her in tight. And I said, why don't we go into Nana's bedroom and we'll take out her clothes and we'll smell them together and we'll just talk about her. And we did that for probably an hour, and she fell asleep on on my chest, and it was just a real bonding moment, and it was beautiful, and it was like Ava bound us together. Ava's my mother-in-law who died, but
Mm.
that process was so rewarding. Uh, and I remember thinking to myself, I had even thought about getting up and leaving and not dealing with it. And my wife had come in and joined us. It just brought everybody together. So it's those kinds of passages, I think, if we're paying attention, if we're willing to face our own fears and look into what I call the abyss until what I say, God looks back, Jesus looks back, that we see a light opens up and something's there, right? So what initially made me uncomfortable for Elizabeth and me wanting to get away from it, as I went into it, opened up this deep, intimate connection that we didn't have to say very much at all, and it's ours forever, and we
Yeah.
have a different understanding of each other than we would have ever had if we didn't do that.
Yeah. That's courage. I mean,
Yeah.
think about that's courage. Dealing with the humanity.
Yeah.
A lot of times
But
we define courage as doing the scary thing in business or, you know,
yeah,
conquering the mountaintop.
yeah,
And
it's
and what I
pebble in your
heard and
shoe.
what's that?
It's the pebble in your shoe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because if you
Yeah.
think about it, how it's funny, courage comes up for me is I play tricks on my mind because it is courage, but it's courage because I was more afraid of what would happen if I didn't do it.
Mm,
Like that's what I noticed that's one of the big things I do is I really think about if I don't do this, what happens? What can I see is coming? Is it what I want? Is that who I want to become? Because I've done things where I don't like who I've become out of them, and then I got to go correct them or reinvent myself and start over. And so thinking about that ahead of time, if I can see that what if I leave, what's going to come is much worse than if I stay. That to me is why I stay because I don't have the courage to live with what I wanted to.
mm,
Like if I take the short-term gain, the long-term pain is much worse in my experience. And
yeah.
I did that because I learned that people are 5 times more liable to be motivated to stop something uncomfortable than to
Yeah.
go after something they love. And I know I'm like that.
Yeah.
And so the more uncomfortable I can make the possible choices, it helps, if I can look at all those possible prices, it helps me move into what normally I wouldn't have courage for.
Yeah. Oh, this is so good. And I think so needed. And I'm glad you're writing this book. Do you have a timeline on this book when this is coming out?
Well, I've written pages of notes, and I've got notes from my daughter from her experience of life together, and my son. And I'd be happy to send you this link so you can put it in the podcast. But my
Sure.
son has written an evergreen thread on X of his mourning over his son, and it is the
Mm,
most profound and touching. He's just beautiful. He's a beautiful boy, my son.
oh,
Um, man, he's 40, uh, and just this process is so courageous and so touching and so authentically raw. Like he's very introverted, so he doesn't say a lot. And then he just started writing these articles after about a year. And with video and stuff of Eon and his whole process, and it's
mm,
just beautiful.
wow. Yes. Yeah. Please. Then we can put that in the show notes. And also that book that you were talking about. We'll make sure that's also in the notes
Which
as
one?
well. The
Oh,
one that you were reading from earlier.
the Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. It's quite a read. Get the
Yeah.
abridged version, so you
Yeah.
don't have to deal with all the different Russian names. But
Yeah.
yeah, I'll certainly give you that too.
Yeah. Dan, is there anything that we haven't talked about? If there are people out there listening, invariably there's going to be lots of people that are listening that we're all grieving in different ways, or we've experienced grief and maybe have unresolved grief. What would you invite them into as a first step?
I think give yourself a break. Like don't like no pressure. Like,
Yeah.
and then find somebody that you trust, that you believe, that you can stand with, and ask them to speak in, like invite them into your process with you. And particularly if somebody's suffering with you, don't isolate. Get connected.
Mm.
Find awkwardly. It's awkward. It's goofy at first, but man, once you get past that awkwardness, that's why I shared those stories. It's just amazing what can happen, particularly if you're both sharing a loss and you're mourning. You know, when I think of Eon, what will never be, I can talk. My son and I were in Colombia just the last week, and we just talk casually about how much we love Eon and how much we miss him. And, we might start to weep or laugh, and one of us might be weeping and one of us might be laughing. There's lots of room for us to share. And it's so rich. It just like time passes and the connection just deepens. So I would say look into the things that you're most afraid of as best you can, as long as you can, because if you keep looking into them, like that quote from Dostoevsky's book, you're going to be surprised at what arises in you. Like my kids said to me, we're so amazed that what looking into Eon, the loss of Eon has produced, that we've become something we never imagined we could become.
Hmm.
And then that's what that's my encouragement is
Yeah.
to set life up so that you can have those kinds of relationships and that you can call on them and they can call on you and you can because it clears the pebbles up and then you can climb almost any mountain.
Yeah. I think about how I've experienced it and sometimes how I've seen other people experience and they get bitter and they look
That's
into
the
it,
other.
but they look into it it's with a certain lens. So what is the lens? I mean, the lens of love, the lens of grace,
Yeah,
compassion,
yeah,
empathy for
yeah.
themselves so that they don't actually get bitter.
Well, cynicism is, I read this a long time ago, that a cynic is a passionate human being who's vowed never to be hurt again.
Mm,
That like cynicism is such a racket. It's the way I play God because I don't believe there is one. He's not going to take care of me. So I'm not going to let myself get too involved with anyone or anything. And the minute I can see they can hurt me, I'm getting out. And that's the only option. You're either going to become bitter and resentful over your loss, or you're going to become much more compassionate and tender to the people around you, particularly those that in the past may have irritated you. You may begin to see into their lives in a way that you can embrace and contain whatever they're doing that irritates you long enough to connect with what's really going on with them if you care about them.
yeah.
So
Well, I think we could all use a lot more of that
I know
in
I
even
can.
this world as well. There's so much going on. And if we
Oh
could hold
man.
the space for that, I mean, it's like probably one of the number one, the thing that nobody really talks about, but then one of the number one things that needs to be talked. We talk about the symptoms, we talk about anxiety, we talk about depression, we talk about all
Yeah.
the things, um, but not talking about where it's actually coming from and how to deal with it. So
Yeah,
yeah, so
I
this is
agree.
important.
This gets to the root, and it's amazing the freedom in it. I cannot. I pinch myself. I've been married almost 50 years, and I love my wife more today than I ever have. And I see her growing, and she's really out there doing things. I see the family doing that, but I'm really clear we almost split up. We almost divorced 2 or 3 times in the process, and the willingness to suffer together has saved us. And I've seen it save my family, and I watched it save my mom and my dad. As my father started to look into and own his what he missed and his mistakes and own them, and it brought us all together, right? And the last 30 years of my mother's life, she was best friends with my dad's second wife, and they believed completely different politically, got along really well. There just was a bigger realm than that. They were really connected. My dad bought it, and his wife took care of her as she got older. And unfortunately, she died in the fire. She died of a poisoning from the fires at 82. Well, she probably would have lived another 5 or 6 years.
Oh, wow.
And that was a whole mourning in itself, because the doctors made mistakes and there was all kinds of stuff, and you had to walk through it with the family. So
Well, and then you talk about what you just alluded to is that the impact of somebody else's actions that can create things, that's a whole other
it's another world,
conversation
man.
around that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, we'll leave it there. But Dan, thank you so much for sharing your own personal experience with it and what has helped you through it and helped so many others through it. We're going to make sure, obviously, your links are all in the show notes so people can find out more about what you're doing. And of course, follow you on social and sign up for your newsletter. So when your book does come out, that they can hear about that. And
Sure.
yeah. And thank you for our listeners, our viewers, anyone who's still there with us, thank you for listening. And we invite you to maybe listen to it again, to explore, get curious about your grief that may be unresolved, get curious about those pebbles in your shoe, that you can explore them, look into the abyss, as Dan has talked about, so that you can get the healing that you deserve and it's meant for you.
It's good. Yeah, it's like, I would recommend picking up Jordan Peterson's new book when it comes out, That We Who Wrestle with God, because he uses Abraham and his journey in life as a pattern for human spiritual development.
Mm.
And that the God of adventure is always calling us out of comfort into a progressive series of sacrifices that will draw out of us our divine being and heaven here on earth. The ability to stand and not become a product of the circumstance, but the ability to order circumstance and release beauty. So you'll love it. It touches on a lot of these principles. So
yeah. That's awesome. Well, actually, I saw his book coming out. I haven't read it yet, but
I
it
don't think
certainly
it's
piqued
out
my interest.
there. I just went and saw him in his tour. Phenomenal, really
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I encourage you to do that. I always say leaders of transformation take action. Sometimes the action isn't out running the race. It's the stepping back and actually looking inward. And so I encourage you to do that. We'd love to hear your stories. You can find us, of course, on leadersoftransformation.com. You can find us on social, and we'd love to hear how this has impacted you. And if there's anything we can do to help you and support you along the journey, let us know. Definitely, I encourage you to check out Dan's information. Go to his website, takenewground.com, and he's got some great materials there. If you're a leader, if you're, we talked about transformational leadership. This is the essence of even transformational leadership. As a leader, you have people in your organization, not only your own experience, but you also have people in your organization who are going through things. And I think that by exploring what we've talked about here today, it will make you a better leader, not just a better leader of self, but a better leader for others, creating the environment, the space for other people to heal and to grow and to deal with the stuff that is scary. So we encourage you to do that. Again, we'd love to hear your stories. You can reach out to us. And thanks for being here. And we look forward to seeing you next week on another episode of the Leaders of Transformation. Bye for now.